Another round of applause, please, for our amazing, amazing musicians. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes. And another wonderful congratulations to Heather. Stunning, stunning, stunning piece. So while our musicians get some things cleared off the stage and we get set up for the panel, I wanted to share with you some information. For those of you who know me, I love research, and I think the thing that I was most excited about having this conversation was I got to spend a lot of time researching something that I'm deeply passionate about. So you get to hear a little bit of that research to sort of paint the picture for you as we go into this evening's conversation. So the reason we decided to have this event was to talk about the lack of representation of women in the arts. And it's actually quite interesting because in many ways, women are actually dominating the arts field. When you look at who is studying art and getting those college and graduate degrees in artistic disciplines, that is the vast, vast majority is women. In some programs, it's as high as 90% of women enrolled and graduating with artistic degrees or related degrees such as arts administration. Women are also attending arts programming at higher numbers. If you look around in the room this evening, you'll see vast majority are women. It's possibly because of the topic, but I also want to thank all the men who have come out to hear about this topic. So thank you for joining and being part of this conversation. But in fact, women are attending about 56%, 44% of audiences are men, and that number has actually been declining over the last 10 years. So men are attending at lower and lower rates every year. So, gentlemen, invite your friends to come with you to the next concert, please. When we look at the workforce, 75% of the people working in arts organizations are women, but when you get up to those top leadership positions, you would expect to see something look pretty similar, but there's actually a really disproportionate number of men that hold those top artistic administrative leadership positions at 40 to 50%, depending on which study you look at. And women in leadership typically are in your smaller and mid-sized organizations. So the larger the organization gets, the more male it gets at those top leadership positions. And when you look at your major institutions in any city, that top leadership is almost always going to be men. We'll say Houston, we are right in there, maybe a little bit better than the national average. We're at 72% women in the workforce and 61% at that senior staff level here in Houston, which is good to know. So at the top of the show, Alicia mentioned about the 2% of female conductors being presented in classical music. When we look specifically at classical music, 36% of the musicians, professional working musicians, are women. 20% of conductors are women. And when you look at administrative leadership, so those executive directors, CEOs, managing directors, we're at 50-50. So that's great. Parity, we can get excited about that. But when we look at those music and artistic directors, that is only 9%, less than 10% of the artistic leadership in organizations for classical music. And again, as those organizations get bigger, the number of women go down. Opera. Here are some really, really fun statistics for you. Again, it's about 1 to 2% of the works performed are by women, and women hold less than 20 of the top administrative positions, and that number has also been declining. So back in the 90s, you actually had higher levels of female leadership, and that's been declining over the last 20 years. Out of 145 organizations surveyed, there were only 8, not 8%, 8 people, female artistic directors. And when you look at the largest organizations, so 15 million and above, you only have one female executive director in the entire country in Canada. Also, what's interesting about opera, when you think about it, when was the last time you went to an opera and there was a strong female protagonist that didn't have something awful happen to her or she didn't do something terrible? So the stories in opera are also not that great for women, which is a little interesting, and very few pass what's called the Bechdel test, which means you have two women who are talking to each other about something other than a man. Very, very few operas that feature that. Dance is also really interesting. So dance is the least funded arts form, And from my research, it's probably also the least researched. I could not find any good research or statistics specifically on the dance industry. But from best estimates, again, it's about 2% of works that are being choreographed and presented by women, and that administrative artistic leadership, again, very little female representation. The larger the organization gets, the smaller those numbers. But dance is, when you look at the artistry, it's, again, about 75% of women artists. Theater is actually doing the best. So for those of you that are in theater, good job, congratulations. That's where I got my start. 21% of playwrights are in the 2016-2017 season across the country were women. 11 out of 20 of the most produced plays were by women, and 11 out of 20 most produced playwrights, 8 out of 11 most produced plays were by women. So that's amazing. So women are doing well in theater, but directors and producers are less than 40%, and artistic leadership in those organizations, we're looking at about 19%. So when you look at who's creating theatrical, opera, and dance productions, costumes, 61% women, set design, 22%, sound design, 2%, lighting, 8%. Stage managers, though, so the one that's running it and getting everything done, ladies get things accomplished, 70% of stage managers are women, so yes. Visual arts, we have 51% working artists, 25 to 35 gallery representation are female artists. Only 5% of the art that you see displayed in art museums is the work of women, and only 3 to 5% of what's in permanent collections, and only 47% of museum directors are women. And when we look at those statistics and we break it down by women of color, all of those numbers I just shared with you drop by at least half, if not 3/4. So I just wanted to share a little bit with you to kind of paint the picture. So what we're going to do now is going to welcome our musicians into the audience so they can join in the conversation with you. So they're going to come on stage here, and then we will invite our panelists to join us on stage once they get seated. So we got a little shuffle change here. Yes. Wherever you like.
Who do I know in the audience?
And Heather, if you'd like to join us on stage too. Heather.
Heather?
She and Scott were talking about his wonderful performance.
Actually, we were talking about the vanilla ice cream versus what it should really be. Congratulations.
Should have assigned seating by instrument or something.
Did you live in Canada?
Make it more of a you. Yeah. Where are you from?
Well, thank you guys for coming so much. We had so much fun gathering these women. And yes,
I was just wondering.
are you already laughing?
She's directing us. She's like,
Yes.
can we be more of a you?
Yes. Why don't we sit a little bit more of a you?
can see each other.
She's
Want to
already
stand up?
directed
Oh,
us
she's
there.
going. Okay.
Yeah, this is this.
There we go.
Yeah, I can see you.
See, that's what happens.
At least see each other's faces.
There you go. We had a great time gathering, as you can possibly imagine, with this group, and we swore we would do a whole nother one over wine. It never happened. It's going to have to happen. But the conversation went on in a wonderful way, and we realized that we had to narrow down the topics, the questions, the dialogue, and so we put out ideas of questions to ask that they felt passionate about and we felt passionate about. And we came up with 6, one for each panelist, but also dialoguing. And then after that, we'll open it up to question and answer. So for the first question, it's going to be directed to Heather. So I'm going to read it. And we had to narrow it down, like I said, to 6. Every person's gender, race, economic background, sexual orientation, geography, etc., contributes to their personal experiences. However, how we often are measured first is how we outwardly look or present ourselves to the world, which contributes to the experience we have with our skin. How would you say your skin experience has impacted your work as an artist or an administrator?
Well, that's a really thorough question and really relevant.
I need it in 3 paragraphs with a thesis.
You know, I think one thing that happens very commonly in society today is getting labeled as something. And I think it goes even beyond gender and race. You know, for me as a musician, people are often confused. They say, are you a performer, are you a pianist, or are you a composer? And I'm a musician, I'm both. And in the past centuries, most of the great composers, Beethoven, Mozart, Liszt, so many of them were performer composers. Nobody asked them, you know, are you a performer or a composer? But nowadays, it's very, very segregated. And so you get very much labeled by, you know, what you're defined as. And then I think that gets extended even further into issues like race and gender. And in music, in some areas, I feel that there's much more equality, you know, for example, among concert pianist soloists or among a lot of the strings and wind players. It's much more, there's probably a close to equal presentation of women and men, but when you get to roles such as composers and even more so conductors, it is still very heavily dominated by males. And
Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in?
When I read my name is Fleurette, Fernando. I'm the director of the MA in Arts Leadership program at UH. And when I read that question, I thought it was so interesting because, you know, I think about what my biggest challenges have been in my profession, and obviously there are barriers as a woman. There's definitely barriers as a woman of color. But when you talk about skin, I actually think about the skin that will not be the same ever again after I became a mother. It got stretched to capacity and it'll never come back again. But I have to say, though, that I think my biggest challenge being a woman in the arts and a working woman has actually been motherhood. Mm-hmm. Motherhood posed its biggest challenges for me. And I think that is one of the issues that we need to talk about when we talk about women working in any profession, because what we're seeing, and you talked about this a moment ago, Amy, that, you know, we have great numbers in arts education programs, in all of the fine and performing arts and in arts administration. And men and women start out pretty much at the same level, and then something happens through the course of their career. And for a lot of women, that is circled around caregiving. And I'm not just talking about motherhood, but also women who have to care for members of their family, for the elderly, for family members who may have high needs. And I think that, you know, when we talk about women in the arts or women who work generally, we have to talk about some of those societal, political realities around our working lives. And I think one of the major issues is lack of support for women who have to also be caregivers. I think we see a lot of sort of, you know, an exodus that happens for women at a certain time in their life.
Well,
and that does affect the leadership and what we see being produced in the arts. So.
And that's the reason we have childcare during rehearsals and during concerts and after, and the fact that we have a child-friendly policy in our office for children to stay in the office with the mom, and just the idea that to bridge that gap. But did you have the next
I think
question?
that's important.
Yes, so I think, and Heather started to mention this as far as labeling artists. So when you see an artist who is either not male or not white, we always put some sort of label with them. So female composer, Latina photographer, something of that nature. But you never hear men described that way. You would never hear someone say, oh, this male choreographer. You just never think about it that way.
A panel of men in the arts.
Yes, exactly. This is why we're here. So the one of the things that we were thinking about is when you start to put that defining term around whatever kind of artist it is first, do you find that you are limiting that artist or limiting the perception of that artist's work? So Lauren, I would love for you to chime in
And
on
everyone
that.
knows you, but Lauren Anderson.
Hi, my
yes.
name is Lauren Anderson. I was a ballerina with the Houston Ballet for a very long time, and now I'm presently the Education and Community Engagement Program Manager. okay? Talk about labels. Very interesting. Wow, how do I start with that? Okay, let's start with this. The worst thing, I think, for me personally, I can only speak with my skin experience, is, hi, this is Lauren Anderson. She's the first African-American prima ballerina in the Houston Ballet. It's like to legitimize why I'm there, number one. Number two, so what do you do? Well, I'm a dancer. Oh, so have you heard of Alvin Ailey? So you're a modern dancer. Okay. No, actually, I am a Trina. I am a ballerina, and didn't get kind of good at modern until it was time to retire, but, it's just that whole label thing. I just kind of want to just be Lauren Anderson, the dancer with the Houston Ballet.
I mean, isn't it also just another way of expressing otherness? It's like emphasizing otherness, which we've already dealing with otherness as being women, but then we also have to take it a step further. Like, why do we need these definitions around that?
And it's not the first thing is awesome. Did I do that on purpose? No, I just did what I did. And all I wanted to do was just be the best dancer I could possibly be. It wasn't on purpose. Sure. But I mean, because I've been this color my entire life. So, this is just it. It just is. But the person that's the first, I don't know, it's like, was the first woman ballerina in the Houston Ballet, like, this is the first European woman in the Houston, I mean, I don't know. It's just, I think, I get the first part. It is important. It is very important because it creates conversations like this. However, that label is just a little bit like, very restrictive. Like, the only reason she's here is because she's different.
At least
She's the first one.
I mean, I think that, there is validity in, sort of being the first. I work in contemporary performance, and so, usually talking about like being a woman of color and being a curator in the field is not common. But, it's like, here I am admitting this to a room full of mostly people that don't know me, like, it leads to deep insecurity in my work, right? It leads to like a lot of feelings of like imposter syndrome. Like, am I here because I'm a woman? Am I here because I'm a woman of color? Did I get here because I'm diversifying an organization or a conversation or an experience? And, men and white men do not have to have that experience. Like, they walk into a room and it's assumed that they're there because they're qualified to be there. And I walk into a room and I wonder, why was I asked to be here? Why was I hired for this? Why was I asked to be part of a conversation? And it's exhausting.
Yeah. And I see some of those insecurities even go the step up above that and just being women. And that in the ways that we've been spoken to all our lives, or the ways that we've been just taught to be, where we're not supposed to be leaders, we're supposed to be followers, or things like that. It's like we all have those feelings of insecurity, or I can't remember the word you used about
Imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome. Like, somebody's going to pull away the curtain and they're going to find out we're held together with safety pins and duct tape. And it's like, but overcoming those feelings just because we're women and we're sort of told that we're supposed to be that way, I think is like the first level. And then you have to take it even further when you're women of color and you have all these other messages bombarding you all your life that we have to overcome.
And I think
It's
artists
been a
in
little
general,
bit, I'm sorry.
I just think artists in general have that feeling. I think all genders have that feeling of insecurity and imposter syndrome. We talk about that a lot in classical music. I love the otherness because it's in the next question. So I was going to ask Mei-Ann, whom you already have met. Fortunately, some organizations are being more proactive in programming more diverse artists in general, just like the group that you are in Chicago. But often it isn't part of their main stage or major exhibits. Why do you feel it's both happening and also a problem? When programming more diverse works, how should organizations reach out to audiences without pandering or perpetrating the issue of othering? Because I know that's probably what Lauren was about to talk about too.
Well, I operate in, the symphony orchestra is one of the very conservative institutions, even though we try to be hip, but the music we play are oftentimes museum pieces. At least, that's what the marketing department always want you to put on, a Beethoven 5, something familiar. And so my orchestra, I work with orchestras that is, majority of the orchestra is in that mindset of we got to make this art form relevant to, the masses. My orchestra in Chicago is almost like the other end of the spectrum. I mean, we do things so outside the box. Sometimes I just want to quit my job. I mean, it's just, it's how do you put a punk marching band on stage with a symphony orchestra, really stretching that. You may remember reading 2006 New York Times. This is before cell phone became a household item. I was a young working conductor thinking, what a crazy orchestra. It was a concertino for cell phone and orchestra. Yeah. And I'm like, crazy. What is that orchestra? And then a few years later, I became the helm at that crazy orchestra. So for example, we programmed a Project W last year. It's interesting because we thought, okay, we have to do art for art's sake. Since no one else is really pushing that envelope, we had a program. So I'm going to share with the musicians here. I mean, even if you're a musician and you look at this program, we really have to hold hands of thinking, is anybody going to come to this concert? So there are 4 pieces. We start with Florence Price, Dances in the Canebrake. If you don't know Florence Price, you're not alone. First African-American woman composer whose work being premiered by a major orchestra when Chicago Symphony premiered her work in the 30s. And then Jennifer Higdon, Dance Car, which premiered by this group in Houston. It was a co-commission. We brought the Chicago premiere later. And then Rena Esmail, who this group also knows. A piece we commissioned, Me Too. And then the last composer, almost nobody in this room knows, Dora Pejacevic, the first symphonic composer in Croatia. And so we thought nobody was going to come to this. And then lo and behold, people came. And in fact, we collaborated with the women executive leadership in town that brought 150 people to our concert hall. And it was interesting to see, sometimes we have to take risks just to see, you have to do it authentically. You can't just say, okay, we're just going to do it for fun. Yeah. You have to build that relationship.
That's right. It's all about that.
And I think organizations need to be better about not strictly just capitalizing on, us talking about diversity and inclusion more, right? We're, going back to some of the statistics Amy was mentioning, we're still talking about white-led institutions wanting to promote diversity and inclusion more, and I think that's important. But as someone who's not an artist myself and has been an administrator and a curator, so more behind the scenes, I want to see more decision makers of color on organizations, right? If it's really going to be a genuine effort, which I agree, it has to be authentic. The face of organizations, who's making decisions, really needs to change.
So Pia, along those lines, I wanted to ask you about representation of women of color or artists of color in general. Where do you feel like there are the barriers that those numbers are still so much lower, and how do we lower those barriers and get those women and men into those positions?
I think, I can speak, from personal experience. I think, there was no roadmap for me to get in this field. There was no roadmap. There was no one to follow. I had no mentorship. I think, that we really need to change that, and that's why I like being part of these conversations, because I do want to be able to share an experience where, being an Indian woman working at contemporary art as a curator does not seem really unlikely. I think to go back to sort of the skin experience thing, my experience is that most people, when they don't know me, assume that I program traditional Indian dance, and they know nothing about me, and they just assume that because you don't see faces like mine working in contemporary art as much. So I think for me, talking about barriers and inclusion, I think mentorship is a really huge part of it. I'm now, 18 years into my career, and I really got my first mentor this year and sort of prioritized that. And I just want to see that happening for younger generations. And as we're talking about, women being in arts education and arts leadership programs, that mentorship really needs to start at that level, if not earlier.
I think also, too, when we talk about the decision makers, our volunteers for our organization, our boards, and those who support the organizations, our donors, everyone, it needs to happen at all levels. Like, it's not even just the program directors or artistic directors, but also those who support organizations need to reflect the face of the change you want to make. And if we don't change how we build that support, then I think also we're never going to see that change, because decision makers aren't there.
I think what you said was really key, because we are the face in a lot of situations, but we're not the voice.
That's right.
And I think that there's a real huge distinction there, because if we're not being heard, then the change is not going to happen. And so, it's interesting when you look at the statistics. Yes, the majority of people who work in arts and culture are women, but they are not at the highest. They're not at the highest tiers of decision making and leadership. And we're still across the board. For every dollar that a white man makes, a white woman is making 80 cents. A black woman is making 60 cents, and a Hispanic woman is making 55 cents. And so there is still those, even though we make up 52% of the world's population, we're not seeing the equity at the highest levels of leadership, unfortunately. So,
I know that you had talked already about this, but the idea behind the barriers we face as we go through our careers, and one of them is the childbearing. I mean, I was lucky my parents live here to help through that, but I will say that it actually helps you prioritize, just saying it out loud, and makes you very good at that. But you also were talking about the next generation and taking care and being in between. What other barriers do you also see in the growth of a woman's career? All of you guys.
Well, it's interesting, because Lauren and I were just talking about, artistic directors of ballet companies. When you think of all the arts, when you think about what is sort of dominant in terms of a female aesthetic and young girls and women, you think of ballet, right? I remember being in ballet class as a young girl, and for every 20 girls, there was that one boy, maybe two. And then as time goes on, that changes. And yet, the artistic directors of most large ballet companies, and we were talking about this, are men. Suddenly it turns, it flips. And one of the few leaders of a national ballet organization is actually in Toronto, Karen Kane, the great Karen Kane. Now, I would say I was actually born in Toronto, Canada, so I'm always back and forth between, the Canadian reality, and an American reality. But I would say that, America, as fantastic as it is, we're very, very behind in terms of policies and politics around supporting women. So Canada, for instance, has 1 year's paid maternity leave. They now call it parental leave. So a man can take that time if he chooses to. Same-sex couples can take that time if they choose to. If you adopt a child, you can take that time. So 1 year paid, parental leave is significant. And it also, of course, then we're down the slippery slope around healthcare. All of these policy issues do directly affect women in the workplace. And so I think, we can't look at any of this in isolation, right? Obviously, all of this is very interconnected to how successful a woman can be, whether she has the support she needs in all other facets of her life. So I think it's a larger conversation.
Lauren, I've heard you talk about that too, about your son and just all your situations in that.
Well, it's interesting because, I'm older, and now we have ballerinas having babies, like just popping them out and popping back on the stage. It's amazing. I don't know how they're doing it. I mean, wow. But when I think about it, I danced up until, I probably danced way too long, but anyway, probably should have gotten off the stage before I looked like a pumpkin. But I will say, the time has changed. Times have changed when it comes to ballerinas having babies. And the stage manager of Match, I'm not stage manager, the head of production of Match had my baby under his desk for the first 8 months of his life, actually. I'm just saying. But now, I mean, we're pumping them out, and it's a little bit different. We just changed our policy, actually, this year with having paternal leave, which I thought was cool that men,
so
because,
important.
sometimes men are the ones that are at home with the kids.
Yeah.
get to leave also.
Yeah,
which
and
is
I think
great.
that that's a really important point because we're talking a lot about women's rights, and this has been said before, and I know it's a cliche, but it's so true that women's rights are human rights, you know? And if we pay attention to supporting and educating our women, it obviously permeates into our communities. And so I think, I'm hoping that this conversation will evolve into one around what is good for communities, what is good for children, both male and female, what is good for men, especially in family units, because again, if women are supported, I think that that has a trickle-down effect to all people. I think that men are losing out a lot when women are not supported in families, you know, unable to take time to be with their children, unable to have all of those things, I think, are wrapped up in, you know, the strength of our communities.
Well, it is a holistic approach, and if you would imagine a panel of men up here talking about the arts, it wouldn't get to this conversation about children, and in some ways, it wouldn't be kind of a primary conversation, but it is holistic, which is what's great about that you support that, and it turns into
And again, I think it's caregivers, because, you know, of course, many women choose not to have
men and
children,
women,
but
yeah.
they may find themselves in the role of caregiver for, again, elderly parents or whatever the situation is. 9 times out of 10, it will fall upon the women in the family to take on that caregiver role. So then that's a broader question about how we value caregiving, right, in our society, because I think that it all trickles down in how it affects women.
And valuing men in relationships, too.
That's right,
and
absolutely.
Inviting them into the experience. And
Absolutely.
work. But Amy?
So Fleurette had started to touch on this a little bit earlier, but Christine, if you would want to comment on this notion that women often serve as the face of organizations. When you look at that marketing material, when you see that prima ballerina, and that's who you automatically connect with an organization. But when we look at leadership and who's making those decisions, like we said, it's typically men, and so we have a disconnect between the face of an organization and the voice of the organization. And why is that a challenge? And again, how do we overcome this, and how do we change it?
Solve it now.
Yes. We're not leaving this room until we solve this problem.
Well, I mean,
We've locked the doors.
So it's 2 questions, right? The first question is, I mean, we're still sexualized as women. You know, there's still Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, and there's still women in bikinis playing Olympic volleyball. And so there is this notion about beauty and women and sex. So I don't know how to change that unless we just are brave enough to say, I'm not going to wear a bikini when I play volleyball. I'm going to wear what's comfortable and what makes me a better athlete. And I think that is going to take a long time. I think, you know, with the Me Too movement, that we're starting to touch upon that, but that's going to take time. In terms of giving women more of a voice, I think it's the same as what I said earlier. We are going to have to push to be at the table. And whether that's where we volunteer and we serve on boards or at our own jobs, we have to make sure that we are heard, and push for higher positions, push for higher pay, and just take those risks. You know, we talk about risks in programming, but I think it's personal risk as well. And, you know, you may not feel like you should have this conversation or say this thing because it may, I don't know, be inappropriate, or it's not ladylike, or it may be aggressive, but you know, we're going to have those conversations just like we're doing now, and we're going to have to push it in the workforce. We just have to take chances.
I think one of the advantages we have in the arts, and we saw a little bit of it tonight, is that the art itself can make these statements. Right. You know, is that putting the work out there is a statement in and of itself. You know, and so I commend you, Alicia and Amy, for making this a priority in your programming. Watching you tonight, P and I were talking about this, watching you tonight conduct the way you did with such strength and passion was inspiring. It said everything. And yeah, and hearing your work, how brilliant it was,
Yeah.
In some ways, that says everything, and I think we have an obligation as artists to really, bring these issues to the table, but we also know that we have this superpower, which is the art itself, I really believe that so much change. I said this, when we were at HPN, again, growing up in Canada, American culture, it's really, they may talk about oil and gas, they may talk about this, it's your greatest export, it was, growing up in Canada, it was all pervasive, it was so powerful, those words, those images, those ideas that were coming out of the arts, and culture, movies and television and music, right? I mean, God, the power of hip hop, and what that was like growing up. It is in some ways more powerful than all the politics and all the policy, and we have to remember that. We should always be engaged and be at the table and have these conversations.
And push to put women's
Absolutely.
work out there.
Absolutely.
And I think what also, it goes back to sort of a previous point, but nurture a community that's going to support that, because
That's
I
right.
agree that the art speaks for itself, but I can think of recent examples where we're now bringing up the Me Too movement. I have seen museum directors fired, female museum directors fired for being aggressive or controversial, for pushing institutions to collect differently or present work differently or include more women or more women of color.
Right.
And then I've seen men, leave their jobs because of sexual harassment issues and get another fancy, cushy job somewhere else. Yeah. And it's I think the art can speak for itself, but we really need to be better. And that goes back to Christine's point about changing who the board is, right? Changing who supporters are. It's
right.
A woman trying to be more inclusive is somehow, we still live in a world where a woman trying to be more inclusive and have what's an aggressive voice is seen as more problematic than a man committing sexual harassment.
Yeah, it's true.
Right.
It's really interesting, I will tell you though, and this is it's a topic, and we're about to move into question and answer, is that on our Facebook post, we did get pushback from a woman in all caps saying, why do you have all female composers? Why can't they just be composers? And we answered by saying, you probably haven't heard female composers, so how do you know you like it? It's kind of like ROCO's programming. You can tell me you want to hear Beethoven 5 again, but don't you want to hear Ferenc again? I mean, it's this kind of thing. You have to be shown and experienced before it happens. And I will tell you, at the office of ROCO, we don't have a cussing jar, but we have a sorry jar. So if you say you're sorry at our office, you have to put a quarter in. So.
Well, and thinking about that too, and I may not even be the right person to say this, but I attended an EDI workshop not too long ago, right?
Oh,
and we were talking about oh yes, diversity and inclusion, but this authenticity and intent is really where it's coming from, and talking about if you're going to do programming that reflects people of color, you can't be an all-white group that puts it out there and expect, why aren't there people of color here? It came to my program. If you haven't involved your community and you haven't involved the people that the music is coming from. So until we get a lot further down the line, I think we still have to say women composers. I mean, it's great to think, we're all humans and we're all the same, and why do we have to see color, or why do we have to say no women? But we're not there yet. It's going to take time.
The point is often made, I think, for me, the point is often made amongst people of color that if someone says why do we have to say female? Why do we have to say Black? Why do we have to say, sort of qualify who someone is? And I get the earlier points of why that's problematic. It means that someone's not seeing you, right? If someone's saying that they can ignore that you're female, or they can ignore that you're Black, they can ignore that you're Indian, whatever, it means that they're not actually seeing who you are. We are different, we have different experiences. So it's don't trust that, don't trust that voice that's saying well, we're all the same, why do we have to qualify it that way? I think, we can look at an organization like this, the decision get made to have this panel because you guys are a female-led organization, right? These are how decisions get made. And these are how decisions like this get made. So yeah, it's you can't, to have authenticity, you can't, we're in this very tricky place, and this is bringing up a huge conversation, but we're in this very tricky place where feminism is now this capitalist idea, right? And we're selling feminism, and we're profiting off of feminism, and and unfortunately, there's still the woman commenting on the Facebook post, women, and especially white women, are perpetuating the patriarchy as much as anyone else is, right? And so it's there's a lot of work to be done to dismantle that.
Also, it's educating your audience. It's educating your audience. I can say from experience that when the Plum turned in the Nutcracker in 1983 when I was a Sugar Plum Fairy, that audience was not expecting to see a chocolate Sugar Plum Fairy. They weren't. They'd never seen it before. So I'm totally serious. And so we're on this place of a new thing.
Right.
You know, we're evolving, which is awesome. So yes, I understand yes, we have to put some labels on it and we have to do some pushing and shoving because we're not there because of history. And it's okay, and it's messy, and it can be ugly, it can be janky, and it can be uncomfortable. And that's okay too.
But it's a long game, right?
It's a long game. And the thing is, we're interested because look, we have people that are sitting in this audience listening. You know, people that are here. It's a conversation that we're having. I have been on 4 EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion.
One just the other day.
Yep, panels in the past 2 weeks, which is fine. I'm like, okay, yeah, I want to hear y'all bat this back and forth because I've been talking about it. But it's something that people are thinking about. It's something that people are talking about. There is progress being made because we're having these discussions. Now, I will tell you a short story. 40 years ago, it came up, where are all the black swans? Great. So Arthur Mitchell, yada, 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 yada. 20 years after that, where are all the black swans? I popped up. Ooh, great, great. 20 years later, where are all the black swans? Mr. Copeland's here. Oh, great, okay. So 20 years later down the road, we're gonna have a pause, and 20 years later, we're gonna have this discussion again. Let's hope not. We've got more discussions happening, and some of the boards are changing. I'm not crazy. I know that when someone calls me to be on the board, it's a combo platter. We got a black chick, a woman, and an artist. Okay, so it's a triple thing, and I'm okay with that.
You're a bento box.
I'm okay with that because hopefully I get to go to the table and help create change, help change some ideas, help educate someone, not say, oh, well, I feel like this, no, let's talk about the real thing that's going to make some change. So hopefully, I don't know if we have to crawl to the table or if we scoot our chair up to the table, but as long as we get in the direction of the table.
We have to make your own.
Because we haven't even made a table.
our table.
And that's what happened tonight. A table was made tonight,
And you know
right?
what, I think that this is very important because we talked about sort of these hierarchies and these institutions and that, we're not getting there. But, and you said this the other day too, Alicia, is that we also have to acknowledge the entrepreneurial spirit that is happening in all kinds of communities, in underserved communities.
Yes.
And there is something to be said about make your own.
Yeah.
Okay, you may not have the dollars and cents or the power or the this, that, and the other, but again, by putting it out there in whatever way, shape, or form, that is a statement of empowerment.
Well, and a lot of the systems that were, the way organizations are structured, the way the philanthropy is structured are formed from patriarchy.
That's
so
right.
Creating your own space and creating a different conversation and creating a system that we're at a point where we're creating a system that doesn't really exist yet. Right, we're in so I think things are turning and evolving, but we have to create all new tools rather than participate in the tools that we haven't had access to.
I agree.
So, well, of course, as the conversation is getting really heated, and we'd love to keep talking about this, but we want to make sure that we have time to get your questions. So any of you, and our musicians included, have questions for our panelists that you would like to hear them talk
We've
more
got
about.
mics to hand to you, so just raise your hand if you have a question. This is Jason Stevens. He's our librarian.
Yeah. I guess before I ask my question, a comment as a female running a company now and growing up in an environment that's male-dominated, but I had some really wonderful mentors along the way. But I have a different perspective. So as I hear Lauren talk about her experience, I grew up going to the ballet. We had season tickets, and you were the ballerina, and I didn't know that we needed, or that we didn't have ballerinas of color all over and at every ballet company. To me, it was, and if I went to a ballet with my parents and Lauren wasn't dancing, I got pretty upset at Mom because she picked the wrong night. So for me, that was normal, and.
Well,
Right, that's
right,
the
and
most
that's what I was
diversity in
talking
the
about,
nation.
education. So in 1983 is when it started, and I was there after that for 25 years.
Yes,
So people got used to seeing it, right? But there's topics that we're talking about right now that people aren't used to.
Absolutely.
And that's where the making of the new table, crawling up to the table, getting on boards, just having a voice. Because if you don't have a voice, it's like when people say, oh, well, I'm not going to vote because of whatever. Well, then don't bitch about it. Do you know?
Well, the
It's
reason
like
I bring
having
that
a voice.
We're in such a unique environment in Houston, and I didn't know, because I grew up here, until I left, just how diverse and open Houston is. When you say make your own table, we are in an environment in Houston where a bunch of artists can get together and create a thing. I'm going to put a show in my garage apartment. I'm gonna, start an orchestra. I'm going to have a dance company, and people come and people participate. And when I went to other cities, I found that that wasn't the case. That there would be these artists with great ideas, but they didn't have the support from the community. And I think that's something we mustn't take for granted in Houston, because it's a very special place.
Which was my wanted to make that point. I think we have a unique environment here to launch further than maybe some of the other cities in the U.S. have had. And it's nice to have an experience personally that my normal is where we'd like to see everyone's normal be at some point. But to my question though, I have had a lot of great mentors who saw something that I was doing that they found really attractive and wanted to support that. And they were men. I actually had not had female mentors in my profession. And I'm curious to hear in any of your experiences of those men who did lift up what your efforts were and saw your talent and didn't just say, oh, well, you're a woman and so let's do this or help you out, but saw you for who you were and what you brought to the table. And what did that do for you?
Well, I can say that, as a composer, I've never had a female composition teacher, ever.
Wow.
And but I also never felt that I never felt like I was being taught differently or approached differently from the actual teachers. It's more outside the world itself. When I was a student at Indiana University, there was, I don't know, I think there were like 40 composition majors, and I think there were 2 or 3 women, and that was not that long ago.
Yeah.
But I never felt like I was treated differently for being a woman, but I also never had a female composition mentor.
And I think that would sort of be my response, because I brought up mentorship, is that I've had, I have had men try to sort of nurture my career, but the power of having a woman and having a woman of color mentor me is incomparable to any of the support of those men, because I can have a conversation where I don't feel like I'm qualifying myself. I don't feel like I'm qualifying my insecurities as a woman. I don't feel like I'm qualifying my insecurities as a woman of color. I am speaking to someone who has done this work and gets it. And so we can just really get to sort of the work that I want to do career-wise, rather than the work that I have to do in like sort of my personality or who I am in the field. So it's not that I feel like I'm coming from a position where I have felt like actively sort of squashed by the men that I've worked with and worked for. It's just there's an immense power in being mentored by a female.
My mentor was a man. I don't think I've ever been directed by a woman director for ballet, because there's only 2
Yeah,
women.
we've been trying
not
to figure
2%.
it out in the green room there.
But I will say,
And who was the
The
other
Miami.
Miami City Ballet.
Lourdes Lopez.
Lopez, yes.
Who was a fabulous ballerina, by the way. But Ben Stevenson was the director of the Houston Ballet. He actually said to me, you have a good singing voice, you won't be a ballerina, but if you go on Broadway, you just want to keep taking ballet. Kept taking ballet. He hired me, made me a star, and told me when he hired me that he said, I'm just going to tell you, you're going to have to be better for people to think that you're as good as, at least for a little bit, until they get used to you.
And it's generational. My oboe teacher, one of them at Juilliard, was one of the teachers who told women not to wear heels and shoes for the auditions behind the screen, so that they didn't know a woman was behind the screen. And it was a generation that had to be taught that. So that kind of mentorship was really interesting too. But I will say that I'm super proud too, because the woman who just asked the question is our board president. So she's a woman. But just it's a really great board. Do we have other questions, please? Yes, Holly.
And for those of you that are watching on the live stream, we also welcome your questions as well. Greta's been keeping an eye on those, so feel free to put that in the comments. Go ahead.
So, yes. When we talk about mentorship, how do you compare that to sponsorship? Because sometimes you get mentors, but it's the sponsors who take you to the next level. The mentors can help you along your level, and you may differ with my interpretation, so I want to get your take on that. And how do you create your board of directors, your personal board of directors? So when you are in your career early, you may get a mentor, and then you look for a higher position, you need a sponsor. And then when you want to really have real discussions about what you're doing and what you would change, you need your board of directors. And you form that as your kitchen table. And you're very honest about your strengths, your aspirations, what needs to be improved. And those people on your board of directors will be very honest with you. So I think you have to stratify how you get your promotions or how you get your acceleration in your career. And then while you're at it, you also have to be the change that you want to see. And it's not just about Mahatma Gandhi. It's about women, helping women to get to the next level. Because many times women are the individuals who step on your fingers while you're trying to climb the ladder.
We had that conversation without
So
one.
I think there's a great question there, is how do other women get in the way or have a
I
hold
think, you know,
each
when
other
you're
back?
scrambling for crumbs, it can get really nasty.
Yep, it's true.
And that's what it is.
Especially
We're
in
all
classical
scrambling for crumbs.
Well, and we're all.
And so I think there's a level of, and this happens also in cultural communities as well. It can sometimes be a race issue as well as a gender issue. Is that when you get a tiny sliver of the pie and you're a woman somehow with a little bit of authority and a little bit of leadership, then you become very territorial of that. And so that can play out in not advancing other women. We have seen that for sure.
But don't
That's
you think
real.
it's time that has been going on for so long?
Sure,
So
sure.
how do we change that? And when do you have the conversations when you are going for the crumbs? When it's two of you, there's only one position, or it's three of you, there's only one. How do you have that? And when will you have that conversation to say, you know what?
Well, you know what? I hope in my lifetime I get to see pay equity right out the gate. I hope that there is equal pay for equal work in my lifetime.
Yes.
But I don't, at minimum in my daughter's lifetime. I don't think I will see it before I retire. But I think it starts there. I think that there needs to be a real conversation about equity, pay equity, because this really does come down to economics, I think, sometimes. You know?
Very much so.
Because where the money is where the power is, and that's kind of what we've been talking about in very different, you know, where the voice is where the power is where the money is where the prestige is, and that's why you don't see many artistic directors of major ballet companies, why you don't see a lot of female playwrights on Broadway, why you don't see, because it's that upper echelon, that upper tier, right, where there is that money and power and that we have been shut out from. So I think that maybe, you know, I certainly don't have all of the answers, but maybe it does start at that level where we have to pay for that, we have to fight for that level of equality before we can start talking about the interpersonal
I
dynamics.
think EDI is the beginning, but I think we have much more to do with EDI.
For sure.
I mean,
I
it's just a
agree.
platform, but you have to get beyond the EDI and get into substance.
I agree.
And it's substance over form.
I agree. I mean, me personally, I'll just tell you from a personal level, I'm an educator, you know, so I'm a professor in a university where I'm working with young women every day. And I've made it a priority, and you know, it has played out that way because just as you said, 90% of the women in the arts leadership program, arts administration program, 90% of the students are women. And so I have a personal commitment and I feel a personal obligation to mentor those students, to position them in the best possible way so that they will be successful. And so for me in my own little sphere, in my own little world, I hope that I'm affecting some change in that interpersonal, you know, relationship that I have with them. But you're right, there's this sort of the macrocosm and the microcosm. What can we do as individuals in the day-to-day? How can we have impact, on the people, on the women who are around us, young women in particular, by setting examples, by being mentors, by continuing to dialogue. But then there's also those larger political policy issues that we have to be engaged in as well, because one thing is connected to the other.
And don't play into the game. Don't be territorial. Don't not be supportive of the same person who wants the same job as you. If it's another woman, she may be the better woman for the job. We have to support each other. And I love your idea of building your own personal board of directors, because sometimes we do have to seek out mentors. They don't come to us. And we have to ask. And sometimes you have one mentor for one thing and one mentor for another thing. But as you and I have gotten older, the other thing we can do is be mentors. And so I'm participating in a mentorship program through a group that I'm on the board of. And my mentee is a young man who was put into the position of being a museum director at a very, very early age. And the group who was organizing was very wise about that, because they knew that I had managed a similarly sized organization and had also become a director at an early age. And yet now that I'm older, I've had some experience. And so I'm hoping that even in those small ways, we build community and help spread the message that we are all in this together, men, women, and we create these communities. We may have to be aggressive about it, but we don't have to be territorial, and we don't have to step on fingers along the way. We have to lift each other up all at the same time.
I think that's an interesting idea of mentorship, but I don't think in the arts, the artists, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but the idea that more musicians and orchestras or artists really don't think about or talk about not only a mentor, but a board of directors idea around you. I mean, you have your friends, you do that, but it's not kind of this plotting in your career of what's next and what can happen. I think that could be interesting, because I think administration-wise, that's what you're trying to do. But as an artist, you're not. And I think that could actually really dramatically change our field, to be invited to the table like that. Any questions down here? Oh, please, please.
It's interesting about, I don't know if my mic is, taking away, I think oftentimes we think we have to be in a position of power and money in order to make change.
Right.
And sometimes it starts with just having a dream and act on it. So here's an example. My orchestra is only 2.5 million. That's tiny compared to like the Houston Symphony. And so we have had the Mei-Ann Foundation, which is really hard to get the funds for the orchestras. And so we just simply approached them and said, there isn't such a conducting program in the country. We would love to see, because the Chicago Sinfonietta was funded by the first African-American conductor who has appeared with 50 orchestras in the world. And so it just makes sense, if you look at conducting world, there's really not a whole lot of conductors of color. And so it was just simply a dream of pitching this. Wouldn't it be great to have a program to help produce more, of Maestro Freeman, someone like that. And so this is about 4 years ago, and we had this dream, and I started sort of taking on young conductors, even though I'm a young conductor myself, but just whatever I could share. And so 4 years later, it's amazing how sometimes the money will follow when you have a dream that's catching someone's imagination. And so the Mei-Ann Foundation has literally renewed their probably close to $600,000 in terms of their commitment to us. And so the amazing story I wanted to share is we didn't know this was going to fly. There's no such conducting program in the country. It's crash and burn. You're on the podium with a professional orchestra. Nobody teaches you how to handle a Porsche, how to drive this Porsche, and be careful. Don't put on the pedal too fast, because it's going to jump off the track. And so it's a crash and burn industry. And so I am happy to share that through our trial and error, we were able to produce 7 fellows, all conductors of color, 2 of them women, and all 7 of them have secured a professional position in the country.
Wow.
And that's a small impact into creating this changing the landscape. And maybe one day they will be in a big orchestra, like, do the male at Los Angeles Philharmonic, and maybe they can change the landscape even huge.
That's beautiful. Do we have maybe one more question down here? Yeah, there's one down here. You can. Why don't you just shout it out?
First off, I just want to
There.
say that
Oh, there's your mic.
First off, oh wow, that is really loud. I just want to say that I'm very impressed at all of y'all's success. But my question is, if anyone were to try and block your road to success, what would you do about it? Like, how do you handle that?
How do you make your table?
I mean, it's maybe a theoretical answer, and me kind of repeating something I said earlier is like someone's trying to block your road to success, find a different road.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't
Yeah.
take no for an answer.
Because again, the roads that have been laid out in front of us are largely created by a patriarchal society and created by men, and so it's finding a different road. It's finding a different path. I don't necessarily feel like I grew up blocked by men in my career, but I do think that I had to create my own sort of roadmap about how to get here, because it just didn't exist for me.
I would love to jump in on that. I would have not gotten where I am in my career if it weren't for people saying, I don't think you can do that. Who are you? That was my biggest motivator, was to prove them wrong.
Yeah.
And it's delightful when someone has said, oh, no, we're not interested, or, I don't think you're ready for this. And you jump in and you prove them wrong. So use it as your motivation.
The other side of that too is just being true to yourself. Seeing your enthusiasm on stage, and just your love for what you're doing is inspiring. And so you are you. Like you're not trying to do anything but be you. Just follow your heart and be intent and be true. Don't try to do anything else but what you really want to do. We need to make new models.
We always say in ROCO, be human first and be integrated in your art, because for about 30 years I was not. And I think that's really important. When Harvey hits, what do you do first? Maybe not grab your instrument, maybe help them get out of their house, things like that are really important. So thank you for this. We have one more question for the panel that I would love to answer, and as always, on a high note, literally, we want to ask you guys, what positive steps from each of you, briefly, can everyone take to create more pathways for opportunities for women? Mei-Ann?
I think starting by believing that it's possible, and just to tie everything together, sometimes you have to imagine the impossible. And you have to be the first one to believe that it's possible. So if you let people to tell you, in the orchestra world, the giants in our orchestra world, it's like, conducting is hard. It's like moving a mattress. It's just, it's clumsy, and it's just, and the big organization, the big orchestras are clumsy too. We just have so many rules. But to be able to think outside the box and say, okay, I can't get from here to there, but maybe I can make a detour. Be creative and let that passion drives your creativity. And don't let people tell you can't. Use that as a fuel. So I couldn't just walk into a music store and say, I want to buy an orchestra. Yes, if I had $1 million, but I didn't. And so instead, I fed my classmates Chinese palak for them to be my ensemble. And so I think if you love it so much, you will find ways to overcome a lot of obstacles, create your own table.
Be fearless. I think that you just have to be fearless. I've been very fortunate to have been given challenges, given jobs that I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I just went for it because it sounded cool, and that's the next thing I wanted to do, and I knew I didn't even know what I was doing. But Thankfully, I was given opportunities to move forward and given challenges, and I met those challenges. But in terms of bringing more women into the conversation, whenever you have an opportunity to, if I'm curating an exhibition or if I'm choosing an artist to do a public program, maybe my first choice will be a woman or a woman of color or a group that represents a diversity of people instead of just like the person who's most popular, they're easiest to get, or the least expensive. It's like, just make the choices.
Yeah. Change your rep. Change the repertoire. Make a absolute, like, seek it out. Make an absolute decision that this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to stick a woman in here, and I'm going to stick a whatever there, and do something. Just do something different. It's taking risks, I think.
Yes.
But I just want to touch on one thing that you said. One thing you asked about really quickly. You can teach technique. I mean, if someone practices hard enough, they can get the technique. Practice, repetition, repetition. But the thing about being you is what makes an artist is the feeling, is having a heart. The thing that makes, one thing that was awesome about watching the entire orchestra, yes, you were fabulous, that's great, but watching the entire orchestra, because as a dancer, you want to become the music. I was a violinist first, right? But the awesome thing was just going and hearing that come from your instrument, but as a dancer, because all I wanted to do when you were playing was dance.
Right.
I was sitting there going,
It's ROCO, you totally
Solitaire, I was going, I thought I had choreographed the whole thing. But it's the feeling that you get when you hear the music, or when you see, or when you feel the musician. I felt the musicians. Even the ones that were hiding behind the people in the front, the ones that were in the back, you feel, it's the feeling you get in artistry. It's making someone feel something. I mean, you can do step. I mean, I can go all day and finally get it, because it's muscle memory. But how do you make that same GDAE speak to somebody? Everybody got the same GDAE. Everyone's got the same fingers, but how do you make that speak? So I think it's having a heart, having a imagination, passion, hope. All those things that you can't see, but you know they're there. That's how I think this whole thing can actually happen. Change the world, because art changes the world. I don't care. Everybody can feel music or singing or acting or something. So I think this is absolutely the channel, the canal that will get it done if it's going to happen. Yeah.
Pia, what's your path forward?
I think, think about the opportunities that you feel like you may not have gotten or been given, and figure out how to give them to somebody else, right? And lift up the people around you, and, sort of pay it forward.
I would say fathers support the dreams of your daughters. When you talked about, male mentorship, I think about my father. My father was an immigrant man, and my mother too, and he had 3 daughters, no sons. And my sisters and I say all the time, the first feminists we knew were our parents. My father was a champion for all of us, and he used to say, he was a working class immigrant man, and he used to say, I don't have a lot of investments, my investments are my children. And so that made a huge difference to me. And so I say fathers and husbands and brothers and sons, be part of this conversation. That's what I would say.
I'd say the key to finding your path is 2-part connected. One is to not focus on other people's paths. I feel like a lot of times spend time feeling jealous and competitive of what other people have, or aspiring to what they want, even envious. And in doing so, you cannot see your own path. And then I think the real key to finding your own path is listening to your heart and following your gut. I feel like a lot of times, especially when there's a lot of talk about going on and everybody telling you what you should and shouldn't do, you can get stuck in your head. But I think everybody has like this inner radar that can actually guide them to their path of following the dreams that really feel right at your core. And I think the heart being led by that and inspired by it and driven by it is really the key to finding your path.
I think that you can also just get an off-road vehicle. That's what I say, to find your own road. Yeah, that's what I would do. So we're thrilled that you were here tonight.
Yes, I love that we're ending on these little bits of wisdom. And And as I was talking with Allison, our board chair, last night at dinner, I would love to challenge all of you to take something that you learned tonight and share it with someone else. And also think about how you might be able to create a path forward for a woman in your life, and whether artist or not. But thank you all so much, and a special thanks to our amazing panelists for being part of this conversation.